Welcome everybody. We're just going to wait a handful of seconds to allow everyone to file into the room. Thanks for joining us this evening. For those of you who are joining, thank you very much for coming tonight. We're just going to wait a handful more seconds to allow everybody to file into the room. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. So welcome everybody to the Cambridge Future of the Island of Ireland series. My name is Niamh Gallagher. I'm one of the co-conveners. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we kick off by introducing our speakers and discussant, just a handful of things to remind you of. We now have a new website which hosts all of our past conversations, so you can either watch those again or indeed you can read about them. We now have created blogs with them and executive summaries, so you can choose the format that suits you best. So I know Iona, our assistant, will circulate the link for that in the chat in the near future. And do spread the word about us. We're on all of the social media platforms and we're quite keen to improve and increase our engagement in the series. We're going to begin with a monthly newsletter, in fact. So we're going to draw on all of our past conversations and think about how our speakers can speak to some of the important political issues that we're dealing with today, political, economic, social, indeed whatever it may be. So do stay tuned to see that in your inbox. And though this is the last event of our term, it is by no means the last event of the year. And we have several lined up. And just to give you a flavour of what some of those might be, we will speak to Monica McWilliams, former MLA, of course, for the Northern Ireland Assembly and co-founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Freya McClemens is going to speak to us as well. She's Northern Editor for the Irish Times, and she's going to chat about the Legacies and Reconciliation Bill, which is now making its way through the UK Parliament. We also will have Maeve O'Rourke. She's a lecturer in human rights at NUI Galway and has been part of the advocacy group Justice for Magdalenes, about the Magdalene laundries in Ireland. And given that the year that it is, we're going to mark the Good Friday, or the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, by holding a half-day event with a series of very exciting panels and even more exciting panelists, and we'll disclose details of those throughout the year. So make sure you're on our newsletter list and you can see all of those events and when they come in and when we have dates for them set in stone. So on to this evening. We are in for a treat. We want to extend the warmest of welcomes to our speaker this evening, that is Daniel Mulhall, Dan Mulhall, recently Ambassador of Ireland to Great Britain from 2013 to 2017, and more recently to the USA from 2017 to 2022. Dan has also held similar roles and very important diplomatic posts elsewhere across the globe. So we are immensely grateful to have such an experienced speaker this evening to talk about foreign affairs, past, present, and future. And his talk is entitled Ireland's Future Multiverse, Northern Ireland, Britain, Europe and America. Dan is also this year's Parnell Fellow, which is one of those weird, peculiar Cambridge things. The Parnell Fellow in Irish Studies at Magdalene College, Cambridge, enables academics of Ireland to spend a year in Cambridge, where they continue with their research and speak to wonderful series like our own. So we're very lucky to have Dan here this evening. Dan is also the author and co-editor of several books, the most recent being Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey, published last year. And he will be in conversation tonight with Dr. Barry Colfer, who is one of our co-conveners of the series and will be familiar to many of those of you who attend regularly. Barry is Research Director at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin. He's also a Fellow in Politics at St Edmund's College in Cambridge, and his research interests relate to EU politics, Irish-UK relations, as well as the future of work. So in our usual format, Dan's going to speak to us tonight for up to 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then that will be followed with a discussion between himself and Barry for a similar length of time. The floor will then be open to questions. Please can I encourage you to send your questions through even during those conversations, just so that we can build them up and ensure we don't leave anybody out towards the end. You can submit your question via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which you will see, and please do use that rather than the chat function. Okay, so then without further ado, I'm going to be quiet. I want to welcome our speakers again this evening and hand straight over to Dan to speak about Ireland's future multiverse. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Niamh, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. Happy to take part in this venture. You may wonder why I'm doing this. After 44 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs, you'd think I'd have had enough of talking about Ireland's foreign policy and diplomacy. But the fact is that, apart from the fact that Niamh asked me to do this, since I retired, I've been conscious of the fact that in retirement, you have more time to think about issues in a broader and sort of more considered way, which you don't necessarily have when you're working as a diplomat, where you have to attend to the tasks of the day and the month and the year, and you're kind of on a treadmill, which doesn't give much time to step off and look at the broader picture. So I avail of this opportunity now that I'm retired to take on the broader picture of Ireland's international outlook. Now, when Niamh asked me to do this a few weeks ago, it was about the time when there was a lot of talk about Oscar nominations, particularly in Ireland, with the various nominations that came the way of Irish actors and others involved in films connected with Ireland. And I came across a reference to this film that turned out to be the winner on the night of the Oscar ceremony, called Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. And it struck me that that's it's almost like a summary of foreign policy, because foreign policy has to deal with everything, everywhere, all at once. So it got me thinking about, because I know that I haven't seen that film, by the way, but I know it's about a multiverse where the main character, Michelle Yeoh, enters into different universes and has to do things to save the multiverse from being dominated by evil forces. It's a bit like foreign policy as well there, I guess. I started thinking about the idea of a multiverse as it might relate to Ireland's role in the world. And I realized that, in fact, we are operating in a multiverse, because there are sort of these various constellations that we are dealing with: Northern Ireland, Britain, the European Union, and the USA. And of course, they're all interrelated to some degree, but nonetheless, we have to deal with them to some degree discreetly, although recognizing the interlocking nature of our external relations. And I realized that on all of those fronts, all four of those fronts, you have a lot of turbulence and change and potential further change on the way. So my question is really, is this a reboot moment for our foreign policy, or can we get away with pushing the refresh button? So that's my topic for this evening. So get down to it. Ireland, I would say, has a more complex external environment than many countries of our size. Because as well as the wider international system, the UN and international organizations, which all countries belong to, more or less, we have to relate to what's happening in Northern Ireland, in Britain, our nearest neighbor, in the EU, and in the United States, where we have probably the number one external partnership, individual partnership. Obviously, the EU overall is a more important partnership, but the US is the number one external partner for Ireland if you look at it on a purely bilateral basis. And of course, there's also a fifth constellation, which is the domestic constellation. And here again, we're in a situation where change may well be a feature of the horizon for Ireland, domestic political change. Because after a century during which either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, or in this case at the moment both, have been in government, that may be about to change in the coming years. Next election is going to be sometime in 2025, early 2025. So we have 2 years now during which we have to contemplate the possibility of quite a dramatic political change, of bringing a party into government that's never been in government before, and that could be a government that has no experience of governing either on the domestic front or indeed managing the country's foreign policy. Now, I'm not making any political point here. I'm not saying anything against, in favor or against that kind of government. I'm just saying that it would represent a change from what we've had until now. So the question is, what would a Sinn Féin-led government do to our multiverse links? And clearly, it would presumably feel compelled to press for an early referendum on Irish unity, which in turn would complicate our relations with unionists and with London, because clearly London would have to respond to demands from an Irish government for an early referendum, and that would obviously complicate the relationship with our nearest neighbour. Likewise, say when it comes to the European Union, Sinn Féin's position has evolved, but they have a long history of being somewhat skeptical about the future evolution of the European Union, and indeed have allied themselves with with groups that have some issues with the European Union in the European Parliament. Likewise, on the wider international front, for example, a decision to proceed with the Occupied Territories Bill, which has been blocked by the government for the last couple of years, could put Ireland in a difficult situation in the USA, because it would risk being seen, rightly or wrongly, by the US Congress as a BDS measure. And there is anti-BDS legislation on the statute book in various states in the United States, and there could easily be one at federal level, because it's already been passed by the Senate, and the House is obviously now in Republican hands. It makes it more likely that that bill would make it onto the statute book. Whether the president would sign it or not is another matter. But so anyway, that's a possible issue that could create issues or create problems for us in our relation with the United States under a new government. So that's the domestic. And then, of course, you have the evolution of thinking in Ireland about Northern Ireland and about our foreign policy generally, which is clearly evolving. The latest opinion poll I saw from late last year, the Irish Times poll, suggested that 66% of the Irish electorate would be in favour of Irish unity if a referendum were to be called tomorrow or back in December. Now, of course, that's a pretty generous margin, but it's not overwhelming. It's not like 90-10 as was the vote in favour of the Good Friday Agreement in 98. I think it was 95-5 or something like that in favour. So here you have now a third of the electorate that has difficulty with the idea of a united Ireland, and that figure could grow clearly as the debate on a united Ireland and the consequences of it, if that debate takes off and captures more public attention. If that issue were to be seen to be a genuine prospect, people might start to think more clearly about the implications. So, to move to Northern Ireland, we are unusual in Western Europe in having an issue like Northern Ireland on our agenda. It is a rare case of a nascent conflict in an otherwise settled part of the world. What we have is a desire for territorial change by peaceful and democratic means, which is up against the resistance of a substantial proportion of the population in Northern Ireland. So whether we like it or not, Northern Ireland is going to continue to consume a fair proportion of Ireland's external policy energies. Last week, for example, in Washington, Northern Ireland was almost inevitably the #1 issue for discussion between the Taoiseach and President Biden. Obviously, I have no knowledge of the exact tenor of the discussions in the Oval Office, but I would be very surprised if Northern Ireland didn't consume much of the time available to the two heads of government at that meeting last week in Washington. Northern Ireland seems to me to be at something of a cusp. Its future direction is, I think, unclear, perhaps more unclear than it has been for the past 25 years. We've had today, I haven't had a chance to look at it yet properly, but the DUP has now said they will vote against the Windsor Framework when it comes up for a vote in Westminster this week, which is obviously a disappointing development from the point of view of those who would like to see the institutions up and running again. So there are competing views, and in fact, almost nobody in Northern Ireland is happy with the status quo. You have a range of views from outright opposition now to the Good Friday Agreement on the part of the loyalist parties, some of the loyalist parties, to arguments for revision that are put forward by some parties in the centre who would like to see the agreement revised somewhat. And then, of course, there's pressure for a unity referendum from Sinn Féin. However, the Good Friday Agreement does have strong support from the Irish government and from those in Britain who value the peace that has prevailed for the past 25 years and want to see that peace maintained. And then, of course, from the United States, where there's a genuine pride taken in the success of the Good Friday Agreement and the role played by America and by Irish America in particular in bringing that agreement about 25 years ago through the agency of Bill Clinton and George Mitchell. It seems to me that Northern Ireland has been unsettled because demographic and political shifts in Northern Ireland have caused attitudes to be unsettled in particularly among unionists. It seems to me that the fact that there's no longer a absolutely guaranteed unionist majority population-wise, and the fact that a unionist party is no longer the #1 party in Northern Ireland, that's all created some nervousness and unsettlement on the part of the unionist community. So it seems to me that there is a need for some effort alongside the Good Friday Agreement, and not in substitution for it, because I'm actually not one who has any desire to see the Good Friday Agreement reopened, because I think it was the product of a benign combination of circumstances that prevailed in 1998 that would be very difficult to reconstitute in 2023 or 2024. So I'm not in favor of going back to the Good Friday Agreement. I think it's there and we have to make it work. But it seems to me that there's a need for some kind of initiative alongside the Good Friday Agreement. And I'm sort of calling this let's call it a compact for Northern Ireland, because it would be good to see the parties at least committed to doing what needs to be done to make Northern Ireland function better in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland in the immediate term, leaving the constitutional issues to be resolved later on. It would be good to see settled politics in Northern Ireland, which would allow for a rational discussion of constitutional issues when those issues become ripe for consideration sometime in the future. And I'm not one of those who wants to rush the hurdles. I believe that every race has to be run at a measured pace, taking the hurdles as you find them rather than trying to rush them and falling over. So turning to Britain, the political delirium, as I call it, caused by Brexit, has made Britain a rather troubled neighbour for the past few years. The Brexit project was, I think, driven by English nationalism, or as I often, when I was in America, I often refer to it as MEGA, Make England Great Again. And it seems to me that the current Prime Minister is trying to represent a return to a more traditional conservative approach, shorn of the flummery of the past two administrations. But the Brexit wrecking ball has not gone away. And the insular instincts that drove Brexit are still, seems to me, alive and kicking. So there's no guarantee that Britain, that the Sunak administration represents a kind of a return to more normal political life and easier for Ireland to construct a relationship with them. There's still that instinct to go for more radical Britain first, Britain alone policies, which we have to watch out for. There is, I think, a need for some refashioning of Ireland's ties with Britain. This was difficult to pull off during the protocol standoff, but it will need to be done as things settle down between the EU and the UK, which I hope will happen despite the spanner in the works thrown by the DUP. I still am convinced that the Windsor framework will sort out the relationship between the UK and the European Union for some time to come. But it seems to me there will always be tensions between the EU and the UK, not on the protocol necessarily, but on other issues. We are neighbours and we have different interests, and those are likely to rub up against each other from time to time in the years ahead. So I would like to see some kind of new structure to make up for the fact that we're no longer partners around that table in Brussels on a daily basis discussing issues of common concern. I think we need something now, not part of the Good Friday Agreement architecture, but maybe something separate to discuss the actual things that our two countries need to be connected on in the interest of our two neighboring islands. Now, moving on to Europe, the war in Ukraine has confronted the EU with an unexpected crossroads moment. To the Kremlin's obvious chagrin, the EU has stood together, maybe surprised everyone, I think a lot of people, both in the EU and outside, that the EU was able to hang together in this way and to impose sharp sanctions, a series of sharp sanctions against Russia and the Russian regime. And it's even developed a new position by being willing to offer direct military aid, lethal military aid to Ukraine, which is a new development. And Ireland, I think, has seen the invasion of Ukraine as an existential threat to the international order, and there's really no room for fence setting in this case, it seems to me, and therefore we have been pretty much out front. Although we're not members of NATO, we have still taken a very strong view that this is politically not acceptable and that we are fully opposed to what the Russians are trying to achieve in Ukraine. So it seems to me that a moment of truth for Ireland's EU membership will come if and when the EU decides to have a serious go at developing its defence identity. Because we know that every other aspect of the European Union is very popular in Ireland, except for defence cooperation. What will happen if Premier Division status within the EU somehow requires full involvement in defence and security arrangements? What will that challenge do to us? How will we respond to a situation where the EU moves forward on defense, which I think is likely to happen if an America First president appears to be likely to take office again in Washington in 2025. I think there would be a rush to try to strengthen the European defense identity in those circumstances, because there would be a sense that America, under an America First president, not under a MAGA president, would not be a reliable partner for the European Union going forward. So this will entail a very difficult conversation with the Irish electorate. It will require careful thought and sustained effort to try to tease out the issues. Now, I am not one who says we should shed our traditional policy of military neutrality, but I think we do need to think more carefully about it, about our defence identity, in order to ensure that it continues to serve Ireland's interest in an optimal manner. Moreover, the migration issue is likely to continue to challenge the EU, and we now know that Ireland is not immune from the political pressures that the migration issue inevitably brings with it. To date, we've been able to steer clear of the sort of anti-immigrant atmosphere which you find in other parts of the European Union, but we've seen in recent months some evidence of a stirring of that kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. Still a minority, I think, but nonetheless will have to be watched. So moving finally to America, we've developed a remarkable set of relationships with the United States, especially considering that we are not NATO members and that we have some foreign policy instincts that are seriously at odds with those of the United States. We work together closely with them, I think successfully with them, during the UN Security Council term, and that was, I think, that benefited us greatly, because they actually, they saw a need to listen and to work directly with us, because they saw that we could do things that were useful within the Security Council orbit. America is clearly at a crossroads, both in terms of its domestic policy direction and also its role in the world. The future is up for grabs there. The solid foreign policy consensus of the past is no more. While EU-US relations are in helpful hands under Biden, although they're still not without tensions, particularly on the investment, on the Inflation Reduction Act. Under a Trump-like presidency, all bets would be off, as there is real hostility in that quarter to the European Union as a project. Even under Biden, the world is being seen more and more as an us and them struggle between the US and China. And the pressure to take sides is significant and growing and likely to continue growing in the years ahead. In American eyes, there's also a growing divide between democracy and authoritarianism. That's how the Biden administration sees the world at the moment. And there's nowhere to hide for a democratic country in that context. The attitude of the global South in relation to the war in Ukraine is very revealing. It suggests that they're not automatically willing to push back against Russia, even in the circumstances that we've seen in the Ukraine with a brutal invasion of a neighboring country by Russia. Can we continue to rely on Irish America for support? They've been, as I wrote in the Irish Times at the weekend, they've had our back consistently over the last more than 100 years. The thing is, they'll always be more effective when it comes to Northern Ireland. They can certainly weigh in effectively there. But on broader issues to do with our strategic alignment or our foreign policy, probably less effective. Still a resource that we should always cultivate. I know we will always cultivate and make the best of it. But and I think it will always be a very important resource for us, but perhaps not as effective, not as powerful when it comes to the broader strategic issues that I've mentioned. So are we at a refresh moment or a reboot moment? Now, I don't like to over dramatize things. There's always a certain narcissism in believing that our time is the time when things are changing in a fundamental way. Usually things stay the same broadly. They change, but they stay the same. There's a certain sameness in developments as we move forward. But I do think that this looks more like reboot territory than anything I have seen in recent decades. All parts of our multiverse, Northern Ireland, Britain, EU, and US, are undergoing upheaval, and all at the same time. There's a lot to think about. Now, we have some assets. We have some real assets that we didn't have before. When I started in foreign affairs, we had about 25 missions. We now have something around 90. So there's been a transformation in terms of our role in the world, our ability to be active players. The Global Ireland policy seems to be a new departure. It reflects a recognition on the part of Ireland, of ourselves, our own recognition that we are now a fully developed country that needs to be able to give to the international environment as well as to benefit from it. So I think there are serious things for us to think about in the international arena at the moment. I think we're stronger than we would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago to address these issues, but they do need to be addressed. And I'm happy to talk to you about them, Barry, and to respond to questions from our audience this evening. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Dan, for that. Lots of questions come to mind, but I'm going to hand straight over to Barry so he can kick in first of all. Thanks again.
Thanks a million, Niamh, and thanks, Dan, for being with us. And indeed, I was so absorbed in what you were saying there, I didn't see the enormous amount of questions that have been coming in. So I'll try and keep myself to my allocated time. I'd like to ask about across a couple of headings, Dan. I'll put first of all something to you about Irish America, then have a question about North, South, East, West relations, potentially something about the EU then and geopolitics if you can get into it. But I may take a step back to allow some questions to come in. In the first instance, Irish America, a topic you know a lot about from your time. I've spent a bit of time in America as well. Irish America isn't just about Kennedy's or even Biden's, as I learned. It's much more kind of broad church now, and there's plenty of people who would vote for Trump's America who identified indeed as Irish American.
Yeah.
Can you describe a little bit more about what the future of Irish America will look like politically and electorally?
Yeah, I mean, I know it came as a shock to a lot of people in Ireland to discover that probably a significant percentage of Irish Americans voted for Donald Trump, both in 2016 and 2020. But that shouldn't really be a surprise, because Irish Americans, there are 30 plus million Irish Americans, and they are clearly geographically, dispersed all over America. Most places there's something like 10%, a bit more in some places, a bit less in others. But, broadly, even if you go to places that you don't expect to find an Irish American influence, you find it's there. So it would be amazing if every Irish American had the same kind of, middle of the road, slightly left leaning, Democrat leaning preferences. So yeah, Irish Americans have a wide range of views. I remember once talking to a very conservative congressman from Alabama, and he said to me, I don't agree with the Democrats on anything except Ireland. So we are very fortunate that there is some semblance of bipartisan feeling when it comes to Ireland. And there aren't many things in America these days that generate bipartisanship. And for example, you saw last week an Irish American speaker hosting an Irish American president in the Congress for the Patrick's Day lunch. I don't think that would happen for any other reason. It's a unique St. Patrick's Day institution that has been maintained even when you had Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump. They sat together at the table. I sat with them 2 years. So look, Irish America, the world is moving on. So you can't expect Irish America to stay stable, to stay in some kind of fossilized condition. No. But I found that younger Irish Americans have a different kind of take on Ireland, in that some of them at least, are quite happy, are quite proud to be connected with a country that's now open and successful and so forth. And the other thing is that, unlike in the past where the tradition was that most Irish Americans saved up for 30 years and then made a trip to Ireland in retirement and, had fairly dated views of the country they visited. These days, a lot of Irish Americans go to Ireland in their younger years and go back again and again. So I think it's a different kind of relationship now. And I'd be confident that there's enough petrol in the tank to keep the Irish American truck on the road for as far into the future as I can see. Good.
And the bowl of shamrock on St. Patrick's Week, that's not in danger, right? From what you're saying, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden.
It survived. It's been through. I guess it's been on the go for 40 years or more in its current form anyway, since the 80s, and it's been upheld by successive administrations of both stripes. So I don't see why. Look, it has to be. It can't be taken for granted. Other countries' ambassadors in Washington are agog at the fact that we get this kind of annual love fest for Ireland with the whole upper echelon of the Washington political world, donning their green ties and green scarves and celebrating the connection between the United States and Ireland. So it can't be taken for granted, and sure. I'm sure no ambassador either now or in the future will ever do that. It has to be worked for. Every year you have to kind of work hard to make it happen. But if it survived the Trump administration, which was a very different administration from anything that had been around for forever almost, I'd be confident that it will survive as well.
I'm sure it was much more acute for you, Dan, in the role you had in the States, but I remember being in various places around the world, and when St. Patrick's Day rolled around, other small nations were kind of were agog, as you said, at the kind of impact or the reach or the penetration that Ireland gets.
Just think of the fact, apart from the 4th of July and the 14th, the French National Day, can you name any other national day? Not many people.
Well, let's not start trading. I know exactly what you mean.
Absolutely. But the point is that it's pretty unique among national days. Only really the 4th of July and the 14th, the Bastille Day, have that sort of global kind of, recognition. Anyway, so I think we're very fortunate to have that sort of, to have that asset, and I think we should be able to hold on to it for the foreseeable future.
I won't ask you about the DUP, I was going to, but I think there's going to be questions in the box regarding that, Dan. But I just wanted to say, when we were kicking off before, so it's 1:45, we acknowledged that I was reading Simon Carswell's piece in the Irish Times. I noticed in the Belfast Telegraph there was reportage around the DUP's moves around the Windsor framework, but it was just noticeable that there was nothing in the BBC, at least not yet, not on the front page anyway. But with that in our minds, I wanted to ask you about what you were saying about the habits of cooperation, or the need to refashion ties between East and West. Yeah. And I've a two-part question. Now, in your new vantage as a fellow at Cambridge, you can speak a bit more openly, hopefully. You were there at some of the really interesting years when you were in London. Can you describe what the nature of relations were like diplomatically between Ireland and the UK, and the extent to which were they as bad below the surface as they seem to be, or were you still able to carry on work with peers and colleagues within the British establishment and from the Irish establishment as well? Can you describe what that dynamic was like at all?
Well, of course, remember, I was there from 2013 to 2017. Mm-hmm. Those were halcyon days, right? In the sense that I arrived there in the aftermath still of the Queen's visit to Ireland. And within 6 months of my arrival, President Higgins visited Britain. So the relationship reached a point of satisfaction, mutual satisfaction and harmony, and even, affection that had probably not been seen ever before. And then Brexit came along. But I left, a year after the Brexit referendum. I left in 2017. And even at that point, Brexit was still it hadn't broken out and become an issue of contention. That happened in the last 5 years as the Northern Ireland issue, became a thorn in the side of Brexiteers in their desire to complete the Brexit project. So when I was there, it was a kind of a love fest, and there was really a very. I mean, for example, I never had any occasion to complain about any media coverage of Ireland during my time in London, but I know after I left, there was a lot of stuff in the the tabloid media which wasn't very very pleasant and so on. So things have definitely become rockier over the last number of years. Nothing to do with Ireland. It's just the fact that this Brexit business became a kind of became a running sore within the British system, and then it spilled over to pretty frosty relations with the European Union, and some difficulty. I think that our politicians had difficulty in the last number of years in relating to the British counterparts, because the Brexit thing was so overwhelming. And that's why, apart from anything else, it'd be good to get the Brexit monkey out of the way, so that discussions between Britain and Ireland could be focused on things other than the implications of Brexit for Northern Ireland.
I'm going to put a teeny question there to you, Dan, and then hand over to Niamh, because I know there's people bursting out of the box to ask questions. So I was just interested in what you said. I think many people would agree with you about the need to refashion, strengthen ties, put things back as they were pre-Brexit, East-West, when relations were so strong. I'm just curious, I think, correct me if I misheard you, I think you said explicitly you were proposing some new engagement beyond Strand 3, something that isn't within the auspices of the Good Friday Agreement, to try and strengthen and re-render relations East-West. Why is that? And what might that look like? Why wouldn't we just draw on Strand 3?
Well, look, I mean, simple enough, right? For the 40 years between, sorry, the 45 years between 1973 and 2017, when the British, stopped going to EU meetings, at every meeting in Brussels, and there were 25 meetings a day on average, every day of the weeks of the year when Brussels is functioning. So there's a lot of meetings. And every one of those meetings for the last 45 years, for the 45 years that we were members together of the EU, there was a British and an Irish delegation in that room, and they were working together on issues of common concern, Europe-wide, but also obviously concern between Britain and Ireland. So I do think that some kind of process which is not connected with Northern Ireland, which deals with the the relationship across the board between Ireland and Britain, the economic relationship, the relationship in the various policy fields where geographically we have obvious shared interests, issues to do with the European Union, which really hardly belong in Northern Ireland in a context connected umbilically with the Good Friday Agreement. So I mean, for example, I mean, before, I really don't know whether this is still happening, but when I was in London, there was an annual meeting of Secretaries General of Irish ministries with their counterparts in London, and it was held in London one year and then in Dublin the next, and they a program of work was was developed and so forth, and it didn't have to do primarily with Northern Ireland. It had to do with other things. So I think that sort of spirit, which was difficult to sustain over the last 4 or 5 years, because of the sort of rows and ructions surrounding Brexit and the protocol and all of that. But if things get back to normal again, which I hope they will, we'll see what happens now when the Windsor Framework goes to a vote in Westminster. But if it becomes the settled relationship between the UK and the European Union, then I'd hope that it would be possible to have more sort of normal discussions between the EU and the UK on other issues, by the way, which are important, but also between Ireland and the UK, which wouldn't have to be all the time feeding back into the protocol issue or to the Windsor Framework issue.
Thanks a million, Dan. It's a pleasure. I'm going to hold my wish now and pass back over to Niamh. Thanks a million, Dan.
Thank you, Barry.
Great, thank you both. Really enjoyed that. And Barry, we will come back to you later on. Dan, lots of questions spilling in, and I suppose broadly speaking, they're in different groups. One is about reunification, a question that pops up fairly often in our series. Another about Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, and one more generally about foreign relations. So I'm going to try and abbreviate some of these questions, not least because they're very thoughtful, which means they are quite long. But I'm sure the speakers will tell me those who submitted the questions will tell me if I'm not entirely abbreviating them correctly. First is from John Ranelagh. Thanks for joining us, John. And John is posing 2 scenarios for you about reunification. The first, I think he's more or less saying, is can you see reunification not happening? Because really it's a decision for the Northern Irish electorate, and right now it doesn't seem like there is a majority for that, and maybe there won't be one. So that's one scenario he's sort of posing. The other is, well, what if it were to happen? And what then happens to the politics of the new Ireland with a considerable unionist vote within it? And he cites the figures of anywhere between 14 to 17% of the new total population would be a unionist vote, which might influence the party political structure and electoral, I suppose, outcomes of the future Ireland. So he's really asking you what you think might happen in that scenario. So there's two scenarios for you, Dan. I'll pause there and let you think about those.
Look, I mean, unification is something that it's perfectly reasonable to desire. I would have a desire to see unity come about, but I'm not pressing on any kind of accelerator at this point, and I'm relaxed about. I'm more concerned about the future of our island. I'm more concerned about the 2 parts of the island working together in the way they ought to work together on for all kinds of very good reasons. As an old friend of mine used to say, you can come to terms with your history, but it's difficult to come to terms with your geography. It's there and it's immutable. So, when you have an island like ours, which after all, was united for all of its history, to some, well, at least from about the 11th century onwards, had some form of unity, and then had unity within the dispensation that was brought about by the Norman invasion. So the division of the island is a pretty new phenomenon. So there's a certain kind of geographical logic to certainly to closer relations within the island of Ireland, which suffered badly, obviously, over the period of between the 1920s and really the 1990s. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on that front. Even just putting aside reunification and just focusing on the kind of practical things that we should do together to for the betterment of our island as a whole. And that's why I think it would be a good thing if Northern Ireland managed to take advantage of the Windsor framework and of its access to the European single market to attract in further investment to enrich Northern Ireland. That would also enrich the island of Ireland as a whole. If it were to happen, I mean, there's a lot of persuasion to be done, first of all, and I'm not convinced that the persuasive powers are fully versed in the issues that need to be worked on, and I would certainly be among those who would have a very liberal approach and believe that if you want to persuade someone to do something that they don't currently want to do, and that's the case, the majority of people in Northern Ireland seem disinclined to favour reunification of Ireland or unification of Ireland at the moment. So you've got to persuade those people. So you've got to offer them something. So difficult for me to say what they want or what offer could be persuasive to them. But I could imagine that some way of reflecting their British identity would be important. Would we rejoin the Commonwealth, for example? Would United Ireland, rejoin the Commonwealth? Would United Ireland join NATO? So there's a whole range of issues, all of which, by the way, could undermine support for the project south of the border, where people may have very different views. So yes, there's a whole range of issues that would need to be considered. And the problem is that it's difficult to consider those issues because it's very difficult to get a unionist voice to speak in those kind of environments. So we can call a kind of a forum on the future of Ireland, but we'll probably only get nationalists to attend, and even maybe alliance people won't want to attend because they don't want to be branded as being part of the nationalist camp. So there's a lot of issues to be dealt with there, and a lot of difficulties in framing those issues and in finding a forum within which those issues can be addressed.
Great, thanks, Dan. And it brings us on to two additional questions on this. I think you've nicely sort of shoehorned us into thinking about them. Sean Wickstead, thanks for joining us, Sean, has mentioned, I suppose, a lack of serious engagement with what a future United Ireland might look like, and what might need to change, for example, the constitution or flags and symbols, the anthem, etc. So he'd like to know, what is your view on this? Why has there not been such meaningful debate in the Republic about a future United Ireland, and what might be needed to accommodate the Ulster-British tradition in a unified state? I think you've given us some suggestions there, but maybe you might say a bit more about that.
I mean, again, I would say that all of those things ought to be on the table, but there's no point in putting things on the table if there's no table. And at the moment, there's no table. So, I mean, I, for example, worked on the Secretariat of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. And we attracted, I mean, Sinn Féin came, obviously, was, party designed to bring them into the political fold. The Irish, the parties in the South came, the SDLP came, Alliance came at that time, and some others. But I mean, we tried our very best to reach out to unionists, to encourage some of them to come down. And I think maybe we had Gordon Wilson, who was then senator in our Senate, who obviously represented a Northern Unionist point of view. I think Glenn Barr came down from Derry at one stage as offering a loyalist perspective, and we had another guy whose name Garland, who came down from a unionist point of view. But apart from that, we were really devoid of unionist input. So it's very difficult to address these things without having. And I really think, and this is why I want to say this now clearly, I really think that it would be to the advantage of unionists to take part in these kind of discussions, to explain to people why they don't think the United Ireland makes sense from their point of view. It's a point of view. They should be willing to express it. But there's a fear that they'll be castigated as Lundies if they turn up even to make a robust case for the union against the arguments for United Ireland. But I do think that it would be beneficial from an Ulster Unionist point of view to be willing to talk. I also think that Ulster Unionists, when they go to America, should be willing to talk and listen to people in America, rather than dismissing and saying Americans have no role in this. Americans have a role if they want to have a role. America is a global power, and it has views on every subject under the sun. And to try and tell them you're not entitled to have a view, or to insult people, as was done to Chuck Schumer, a very powerful senator who's not even an Irish American, he's a Jewish American, but he has an interest in Ireland, and he has a lot of knowledge of Ireland too. So people have to be willing to argue their case and not go into high dudgeon when they come across views that they don't agree with.
Yeah, great.
I'm certainly willing to. I'm willing to debate these things with anybody. And I think people generally that I know of, anyway, in our system, would be very willing to talk these things through and to listen carefully to what's being said.
And the last one on reunification, hopefully just a short one. Do you think London should have involvement in this debate, particularly in terms of supporting the unionist community, who will, one way or another, have to live through the debate that will happen over the next 10, 15 years?
Well, I think London has to be involved, really. I mean, it's not, I mean, they don't have a, well, Irish government's involved, even though we don't have a role. It's a matter we have a role in perhaps you know, in setting out the, you know, the terms of a United Ireland, because I think if one thing the Brexit vote proved is that you should really figure out what something means before you have a referendum on it. So I think there would be a need for us to figure out what United Ireland would look like. And of course, London would have a role because, for example, I think the subsidy from London would be an issue. And I think some discussion would need to take place with London about how that subsidy would be maybe phased out over time, rather than, you know, removed right away, thereby creating this big hole in the Northern Ireland budget, which would be very difficult to fill. So yes, I do think London has a role, and perhaps they have a role as well in maybe suggesting how the British identity of Northern Ireland Unionists might be reflected in future arrangements.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Okay, let's move on to Northern Ireland. We have a question that was submitted in advance to us about some of the conversations that are happening regarding what might be done to encourage the DUP to go back into Stormont. And there's an intimation put forward by the questioner that Chris Heaton-Harris wants to reform or amend the Northern Ireland Act. And the question is, can Heaton-Harris change the already agreed position on a border poll, i.e. to make it a cross-community vote rather than just a majority vote? And what would Dublin do if that were to happen?
Well, I mean, first of all, that would be completely daft, because, you know, the consent principle relates to the consent of the people of Northern Ireland across the board. I mean, nationalists, remember, in 1998 gave up their historical claim, their historical view that the geographical realm for any decision on the future of Ireland was the island of Ireland as a whole, and a majority on the island. And they gave that up and accepted the consent principle for Northern Ireland. Thereby Northern Ireland has the right to decide, the sole right to decide. So I think if you were to move to a cross-community vote, that would actually mean the Good Friday Agreement would no longer would no longer really exist. So I because that is the key element in the Good Friday Agreement, and I find it hard to believe that any responsible British government would want to go down that road. Now, I mean, look, I mean, the DUP says that the union is undermined by the Windsor Framework. In my view, that's not the case. I mean, what kind of a union could it be that could be undermined by a few arrangements that no one will ever see or know about for the most part, and that the business community are quite happy about? They're the only ones really involved in this. Doesn't affect, the rights of individuals very much at all. How could the union be undermined by that? I mean, the union, look at the union. Who's the head of state? King Charles. Who's the prime minister? Rishi Sunak. Where do you get your? Who decides social welfare? The legal system. All these things are decided in London or in Belfast. The element of European Union involvement in Northern Ireland, it's not nil, but in terms of those big issues, it's infinitesimally small, and therefore. But however, if people need to be reassured about the union, statements, can be made to reaffirm that situation. The protocol already says that. But if anything, people don't realize it, but the Good Friday Agreement actually does protect the union, because the effective union is an act of the British Parliament, which could be changed by the British Parliament any time. Whereas the Good Friday Agreement can't be changed by the British Parliament. It can only be changed by agreement. It's an international piece of international law. So far from undermining the union, the protocol, which actually restates the consent principle, is actually a protection for the union.
Yeah, great. That was very clear. Thanks, Dan. Okay, moving swiftly on. Kate Arthur, thanks for joining us. Kate has asked, would you expand on the way you could see the compact work in the immediate term, bearing in mind all other mechanisms to get functioning government in Northern Ireland thus far have failed?
Well, my starting point here is the welfare of the people of Northern Ireland, okay? And if devolution is a good thing in Scotland and in Wales, and indeed in London, where you have a London Assembly, it ought to be seen as a good thing in Northern Ireland as well. On its own, apart from any connection with anything to do with the Good Friday Agreement or anything like that. So therefore, it would be a good thing to restore devolution. It would be a good thing to have the parties express themselves, commit themselves to doing their job when it comes to the running of Northern Ireland. Now, but as I say, I'm not in favor of opening up the Good Friday Agreement. Like, that would be a disaster, because in the current climate, I don't think anything would ever be agreed. The social media age, this kind of negotiation becomes well nigh impossible. It was much easier 25 years ago when I was press officer at the time, and I was the only one going out during the day to talk to people, and I was sensible and disciplined about what I said. If we had an agreement, had a discussion now, everything would be tweeted from the discussions, from the negotiations. Mm-hmm. So I'm not in favor of opening up the Good Friday Agreement, but I do think that some kind of compact between the parties about how they will fulfill their responsibilities within Northern Ireland, completely removed from any constitutional issues, it would be a good thing.
Well, that brings us nicely on to John Cushnahan's question. Thanks for joining us, John. John's, of course, former leader of the Alliance Party and Fine Gael MEP. Yeah. So John has asked, and I'm abbreviating John, so I hope I get this right. Would you agree that the St Andrews Agreement, although it was well-intentioned, it gave a veto to the largest party, DUP and Sinn Féin, in recent years, and that veto system needs to be replaced by one which just elects the executive by a voluntary coalition, which meets the criteria of cross-community support. So really it's highlighting the veto as problematic within this, and maybe even a reversal to the original principles of the Good Friday Agreement, which didn't contain that.
Look, in John's presence, I would say that I'm very happy to see the Alliance Party increasing its vote. And I hope that if the next election will see a further increase in Alliance Party support, because I do think that the centre is really important in Northern Ireland, because if the Alliance Party continues to grow its support, what it will do is it will provide an incentive to the Unionist parties and the Nationalist parties to try to follow and secure some of those center ground votes. The problem with reopening agreements is that you have to look at the. I mean, I do think that the ability of one party to bring the whole thing down is a problem, but if you try to reopen agreements that have been made in the past with particular set of circumstances that provided the impetus for agreement, I just fear for the prospects of getting agreement in those circumstances, and therefore I'm opposed to reopening the Good Friday Agreement, and less so to reopening the St. Andrews Agreement. But even there, I can see some difficulties in getting the kind of outcomes that one might wish to have if you were a person in favor of centre ground politics, as I am, and as I know John is too.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. And there are other questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time, so we won't get to them this evening. I'm going to hand over now to Barry for a very quick 30-second summary on the conversation today and final thoughts he might like to add.
Thanks, Niamh. I've really enjoyed the discussion. As ever, you can hear people starting to peel the spuds at home, so I'll try and be really quick. That just when you thought it was safe to move on, whatever's happening with the DUP, I guess we can carry on these discussions going forward, because nothing is settled until it's settled. On the unity debate, you've shone light on something many of our speakers have done, which is that it's not straightforward either side of the border. It's much more multifaceted. And as you said, you shouldn't have referendums before you have kind of a long, drawn out, inclusive discussion. So, but also I sense that you're optimistic about East-West relations, which is good, and it's reassuring given the kind of positions you've held. I'll just say as well that Dan draws attention to something indirectly, which is that Ireland's diplomatic footprint is radically growing. It's partly a consequence of the UK's withdrawal, is that Ireland is finding a new place for itself in the world as a small, kind of well-heeled, well-oiled diplomatic machine. So it's something we may return to in this series, but I'm going to conclude just to say I'm delighted that a milestone has been passed this evening. Dan also traces his roots to County Waterford, and he's the first Waterford speaker we've had on the series aside from myself. So I'm absolutely thrilled that we've passed that important milestone. I'm going to pass back over to Niamh to close things. Dan, it's been a pleasure, and thanks to those who tuned in.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. Thank you most of all to our speaker, Dan Mulhall, for a wonderful conversation this evening, for a fantastic engagement with all of our questions, and so many questions, so we know it was a really good talk. Dan, thanks so much again. For all of you, thank you for coming this evening. We will be in touch. Please do remember to join our mailing list, see what our future events are. But I may wish you all a nice Easter break, and we'll see you all in the very near future. So thank you from us.
Thank you.
From me and Niamh, thanks.
Thank you.